Each year, Halloween becomes more and more popular. People dress up in scary costumes, walk the streets, and go door to door in search of candy. But few people realize that this night is not just a time for fun. It's a time when the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead become especially thin. Today, I'll tell you 3 scary stories that happen to ordinary people on Halloween night. These stories still haunt the minds of those who survived them, and maybe you should think twice before heading to your next party on this eerie night. Story 1: The House on the Crossroad. Halloween night of 1997 was an ordinary one for Tom and Susan. The young couple was headed to a friend's party and, to save time, decided to drive through an old neighborhood. This area was known for its abandoned houses and grim legends. The scariest of these houses was the one on the crossroad, an old, long-abandoned building that locals avoided. Rumor had it that ghosts of the former residents haunted the place, but Tom and Susan didn't believe in such things. As they drove by, Susan spotted a strange figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man in torn clothes, staring motionlessly at their car. Tom tried to swerve around him, but the car suddenly stalled. No attempts to restart it worked. The headlights began to dim, and Susan started to panic. Tom decided to approach the figure to ask for help, but as soon as he stepped out of the car, the figure vanished. Susan screamed for him to return, but Tom continued walking toward the abandoned house. For a moment, the house seemed different to her, its windows glowing and shadows moving on the porch. Suddenly, the door creaked open slowly. As if in a trance, Tom entered, and the door slammed shut behind him. Susan ran out of the car and rushed to the door, but when she grabbed the handle, it burned her as if struck by an electric shock. Desperate, she pounded on the door, but there was no response. Inside, Tom felt the air around him grow cold. He turned around to see that the corridors he was walking through seemed endless, and the floors creaked as though his footsteps echoed in distant emptiness. Whispering sounds surrounded him, and shadows flickered outside the windows, despite the darkness. Tom kept walking until he found himself in a room with a fireplace. The walls were adorned with old portraits. The people in them stared directly at him, their eyes seeming alive. He froze when an old man with empty eyes and a decayed face stepped out of the shadows. The old man raised a hand and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here. This house takes everyone who crosses its threshold." Terrified, Tom backed away, but when he tried to open the door, it was locked. At that moment, the room began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowered, and the space began to collapse inward. The old man's footsteps echoed closer. Tom heard his whisper right behind him, "Now you're mine." Outside, Susan, still standing in fear, finally smashed a window, trying to break in. She found Tom unconscious in the room with the fireplace. He was covered in dust, and his clothes were torn. It seemed like days had passed, though her search had only lasted a few minutes. But the house looked different. It was in complete disrepair, as if it had been abandoned for years. Tom woke up, but he couldn't remember anything. They quickly left the house, and when they returned to the car, it started without a hitch. The couple drove away, but the next day, Tom began to act strangely. He became distant and claimed to feel someone's presence. A week later, Tom disappeared. Susan called the police, but he was never found. The only clue the police discovered was an old photo of the house on the crossroad found in Tom's car. In the photo, silhouettes of people could be seen standing in the windows, but when the house was examined again, it was found to have been empty for many years. No one ever learned what happened to Tom, but locals say that every Halloween night, strange sounds echo from the windows of that house, and shadows move once again on the porch. Story 2: The Mask That Can't Be Removed. Mark was always a thrill seeker. On the evening before Halloween 2012, he decided to buy a creepy mask for a party. It was the mask of an ancient demon, which he had stumbled upon on an antique website. The legend said that whoever put it on would never be able to take it off. Of course, Mark thought this was just another spooky story and found the purchase amusing. When Mark arrived at the party wearing the mask, his friends were thrilled. The mask was genuinely terrifying, its face twisted in a devilish grin, and its eyes seemed alive. For hours, he enjoyed the attention, taking photos with friends and laughing at their reactions. But when it came time to take off the mask, Mark suddenly realized that it was stuck to his face. At first, he thought he was just sweating, causing the mask to cling to his skin. But the more he tried to remove it, the tighter it stuck. His friends tried to help, but it was no use. The mask seemed to have fused with his skin. Mark began to panic, and his friends suggested going to the hospital. There, doctors attempted to remove the mask with surgical tools, but no knives or scalpels could cut through the material. The more they tried, the more Mark suffered. His skin beneath the mask started to develop sores. Days passed, and Mark realized something was very wrong. He began hearing voices that told him he could never return to his old life. The mask started to change, and his face, as the sores and wounds grew, became more and more distorted. His friends began to distance themselves from him, confused by what was happening. A month after that Halloween night, Mark completely lost control of his body. His movements felt puppet-like, as if something inside him was controlling his actions. The voices grew louder, and one night, Mark saw his reflection in the mirror without the mask, but it wasn't his face. It was the demon's face, the one depicted on the mask. He tried to scream, but couldn't. His body no longer obeyed him. In the mirror, his eyes glowed, and he heard a whisper, "You are one of us now. Embrace your new self." The mask had completely fused with his skin, and Mark's face was gone forever. A year later, his friends found him dead in his room, but when the police arrived, there was no mask. Only his distorted face, resembling the same sinister expression from the mask. No one could explain what had happened, but the legend of the demon living in the mask had become real. Since then, no one dares to buy masks from antique sites anymore. After all, no one knows which mask might be next in this cursed chain. Story 3. The Cursed Pumpkin. Halloween 2005 was especially cold and windy. A group of teenagers decided to spend the night scaring each other with ghost stories and walking around the neighborhood. There was a rumor in town about an old pumpkin patch on the outskirts where, according to legend, the pumpkins were cursed. Locals avoided this place, claiming that anyone who picked a pumpkin from the field faced something terrifying and unexplainable. Jack, the bravest of the group, was always the leader in such adventures. He wasn't afraid of stories about ghosts or curses. He suggested to his friends that they go to the field and pick the biggest pumpkin. The teenagers agreed, thinking it would be a fun way to prove that the legends were just made-up stories. When they arrived at the field, it looked strangely abandoned, despite it being peak pumpkin season. The wind howled through the stems, and the moon cast a pale light over the field. The friends roamed the patch, laughing and teasing each other, until Jack found the biggest pumpkin. It looked almost perfect, bright orange and smooth, as if someone had been taking care of it. Jack plucked the pumpkin with ease and brought it home, proudly showing it to his friends. They decided it would be fun to carve a scary face into it and leave it on the porch to greet trick-or-treaters. After carving a sinister grin and eyes that seemed to stare into your soul, they placed the pumpkin on the porch and went to bed. The next morning, the pumpkin looked different. Its grin had widened, and its eyes seemed deeper. Jack initially thought it was his imagination, but when he stepped outside, the pumpkin suddenly rolled off the porch and landed at his feet. It looked as if it had moved on its own. Jack decided to throw the pumpkin away, thinking it was just a strange coincidence, but the next day, the pumpkin was back on his porch. He tossed it in the trash, but the following morning, it was there again. His friends started joking, assuming someone was playing a prank on him, but soon they too noticed something was off. The pumpkin began appearing in their dreams. In their nightmares, it grew enormous with blazing eyes and long claws that reached for them. Each time one of them had this dream, they would wake up drenched in sweat, only to find the pumpkin on their porch, even if they weren't at Jack's house. A few days later, one of Jack's friends, Peter, disappeared. He simply didn't show up for their meeting, and his phone went unanswered. The police couldn't find any trace of him. Then another friend, Laura, vanished. She had been complaining about strange whispers she heard at night and nightmares of glowing eyes. Jack realized that it all had something to do with the pumpkin. He decided to burn it, hoping to end the curse. But when he set it on fire, the flames didn't touch it. The fire went out, and the pumpkin remained intact. Jack began to understand that the pumpkin was connected to something otherworldly. One night, when he was alone at home, the pumpkin began to glow from within. Jack heard a whisper coming from its mouth. The words were unfamiliar to him, but they sent chills down his spine. Slowly, the pumpkin began to roll towards him, and without thinking, he fled the house. Jack then remembered the story he had heard from the old folks in town. They said that cursed pumpkins could be returned to the field from where they were taken to break the curse. He grabbed the pumpkin and, despite his fear, headed back to the field. When he returned to the field, the moon was high, illuminating every corner of the patch. Jack placed the pumpkin where he had plucked it, but nothing happened. He was about to leave when the ground beneath him began to shake. Black hands emerged from the soil, reaching for Jack. He tried to run, but one of the hands grabbed his leg and began to pull him down. Jack screamed for help, but there was no one around. He disappeared into the earth, and the field fell silent once again. Days later, his parents and friends tried to find him, but there were no traces left. The only thing they found was the pumpkin, still standing in the same spot. Now its eyes glowed, and its mouth stretched into a monstrous grin. The locals decided never to go near the field again, and it was left abandoned. No one dared even to come close. But sometimes, especially on Halloween night, people see glowing eyes in the field and hear whispers coming from the depths of the pumpkin patch. If you want to hear even more scary stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button and leave a comment below telling us which story scared you the most. If this video gets 100 likes, we'll make the next episode even scarier. Are you ready for more terrifying tales?